Welcome. This chapter examines the Sopheric Age, spanning 420 to 300 before the Common Era, a period of religious consolidation, cultural adaptation, and political change for the Judeans. During this time, the Judeans faced continued enmity from the Samaritans, who established their own temple on Mount Gerizim under the high priest Manasseh and maintained a veneration for the law of Moses, though using a mixed language. Judaism gradually lost much of its previous national and political significance, focusing more on religious observance, including the Jubilee and sabbatical years, almsgiving, prayers, and ceremonial practices. Governance and religious instruction were organized through institutions such as the Council of 70 and the schools of the Sopherim. Under Persian rule, particularly during the reigns of Artaxerxes Roman II and Artaxerxes Roman III, some Judeans were exiled to the Caspian Sea. Internal disputes arose over the high priesthood, notably between Johanan and Joshua, with political interference from figures such as Bagos. Cultural and historical writings flourished during this era, preserving the traditions and laws of the Judeans. The influence of Greek and Macedonian expansion reshaped the region. Under Alexander the Great, Judea became part of Cilicia, and subsequent struggles among his successors led to the capture of Jerusalem by Ptolemy, incorporating Judea into the Lagidian Egyptian kingdom. Throughout this period, Judean colonies in Egypt and Syria coexisted with Greek settlements in Palestine, reflecting a complex interplay of culture, politics, and religion. Hatred born from rejected affection often burns more fiercely than enmity arising from mere antipathy, jealousy, or disagreement. Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, along with his Samaritan followers, had once sought to be welcomed into the Judean community, motivated by their reverence for the God of Israel. Their repeated attempts, however, were denied. Nehemiah, the restorer of the Judean commonwealth, steadfastly maintained the separation of the Judean people from outsiders, and with each rejection, the Samaritan yearning for inclusion transformed into intense animosity. Sanballat, convinced that he had been insulted when his son-in-law, Manasseh, was expelled from the high priesthood because of his marriage to a Judean woman, resolved to retaliate. He devised a plan to disrupt the Judean community from within by establishing a competing sanctuary to the God of Israel. Among his supporters were priests descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses, who were legally authorized to conduct temple services according to the Torah. Manasseh himself, the expelled high priest, was positioned to lead the new temple, accompanied by other Aaronites who had been barred from the temple in Jerusalem. Every element seemed favorable for Sanballat's ambitious design, which combined personal ambition with the desire to offer worship to the God of Israel in a new community. On the summit of the fertile Mount Gerizim, near the ancient city of Shechem in the heart of Palestine, Sanballat erected his temple, likely after the death of King Artaxerxes, around the year 420 before the Common Era. The displaced Aaronites, well versed in the law of Moses, had chosen the site with careful consideration. According to the book of Deuteronomy, blessings were to be pronounced upon the faithful from this mount. Yet the Samaritans reinterpreted the sacred texts. They called Mount Gerizim the Mount of Blessings, as if divine favor and salvation emanated directly from the mountain itself. The city of Shechem they renamed Blessing, or Mabrakta. Sanballat and his priests claimed that the mixed Samaritan population were true Israelites, descendants of the 10 tribes, particularly the tribes of Joseph and Ephraim. While some remnants of Israelite families may have remained in Samaria after the fall of the northern kingdom, the majority of the new community composed of Chaldeans, Ammonites, and Arabians were certainly not true descendants of the Israelites. Their own language betrayed this mixed origin, being a blend of Aramaic and various foreign elements, leaving its exact lineage obscure even to modern scholars. Despite these fabrications, the enterprise was successful. The Samaritans had their temple, centered on Mount Gerizim, and staffed by priests of Aaron's lineage. They boldly positioned their sanctuary as a rival to the temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, interpreting the law to legitimize their claims, and proudly declared themselves Israelites. To attract followers, Sanballat offered houses, land, and support to Judeans willing to join the new community. Even those who had committed crimes in Jerusalem or Judea and feared punishment found refuge among the Samaritans. From these diverse and often marginalized elements, a new semi-Judean sect emerged, forming a robust and industrious population concentrated in the limited region of Samaria, with its center in either the city of Samaria itself or in the town of Shechem. The members of this community became energetic, resourceful, and intelligent, carrying with them the spirit of Sanballat. who had founded the sect with both cunning ambition and strategic vision. In spite of its small size, the Samaritan sect has persisted as a distinct community down to the present day. The continued existence of the Samaritans may be regarded as a remarkable triumph of the Judean faith, for it was the religion alone that held this diverse and mixed people together. Their faith became the central guiding principle of their lives, and they remained steadfast in it despite adversity, displacement, and disaster. The Samaritans treated the Torah, the sacred law Moses carried to them by exiled priests, with the same reverence as the Judeans, organizing their religious observances and social life according to its commands. Yet, despite the shared adherence to divine law, the Judeans were not pleased with this parallel community of faith. From the perspective of Jerusalem, the Samaritans were not merely rivals, they were hostile opponents, denying the Judeans the right to exist as a community. They claimed exclusive descent from the ancient Israelites, rejecting the sanctity of Jerusalem and its temple, and maintaining that the customs and institutions restored by the Judean people were counterfeit imitations of the ancient Israelite traditions. The Samaritans watched closely the developments in Judah, adopting any improvements that they could, but secretly wishing to undermine the Judean nation from which they had borrowed its model. The Judeans, in turn, regarded the Samaritans with equal animosity, dismissing them as the foolish people who lived in Shechem, and the enmity between Jerusalem and Samaria, which had begun in the era of the two kingdoms, reignited. This conflict was no longer merely political, it had become deeply religious, making it all the more intense and bitter. The presence of the Samaritan sect, however, had an unexpected effect. The Judeans, continually confronting the beliefs and practices of their adversaries, were forced to examine the essence of their own faith. The Samaritans compelled them to define clearly what distinguished the Judeans from both the surrounding heathen nations and from neighbors who, like themselves, worshiped the one God and recognized the same revelation. Judaism, the faith of the Judeans, ceased to be merely a matter of racial descent or national identity and became a matter of religious conviction. The name Judean came to signify anyone who adhered to the Jewish faith, whether a descendant of Judah or Benjamin, an Aaronite priest, or a Levite. Its foundation rested upon two essential principles, the acknowledgement of the one God and the observance of the Torah, in which God revealed himself through Moses. With the influence of Ezra, the scribe and priest, and Nehemiah, the governor of Judah, the reverence for the Torah deepened. Whereas in earlier generations it had often been neglected, now it was regarded as the ultimate repository of wisdom, comparable in reliability to the sacred Urim and Thummim, the divining instruments used by the high priest in judgment. Hebrew poetry celebrated its truths, and the law became the fundamental framework for the Judean community. Decisions, actions, and judgments were guided by its precepts. Slavery, once a common institution, disappeared. Even a willing Judean could find no buyer for himself. The year of Jubilee, intended for the release of slaves, became largely unnecessary, but the sabbatical year, when fields were left fallow and debts forgiven, was strictly observed. Persian authorities were likely persuaded to suspend taxes during this year. Care for the poor became a central tenet of society, and almsgiving was regarded as the highest moral duty. Towns appointed officials to oversee the welfare of the needy, ensuring that the prophetic commands against oppression were faithfully applied. Public courts of justice were held twice weekly, on Mondays and Thursdays, in all major towns, reflecting a remarkable discipline and conscientiousness in the administration of the law. As life in the Judean community was organized strictly according to the Torah, it became natural to create a supreme court of justice empowered to interpret and enforce the law. Deuteronomy had commanded the establishment of such a tribunal to provide final judgment in difficult or disputed cases. The number of members was set at 70, reflecting the 70 elders who had assisted Moses in his leadership, representing the chief families of Israel. This court, called the Great Assembly, became the guardian of the law and, at times, wielded significant political authority. Its members were drawn from the leading families, and the high priest, whether meritorious or not, presided as father of the tribunal, known in Hebrew as Ab Bethin. The formation of the Supreme Council marked a decisive turning point. It took up and advanced the work begun by Ezra and Nehemiah, embedding the Torah into the everyday life and customs of the people. Through this institution, Judaism was no longer merely a set of inherited traditions or scattered observances, it became a coherent, organized religion, capable of sustaining the community and guiding the society. The Supreme Council brought about a complete revolution in Judean life, assuring that faith, law, and social order were inseparable, and that the principles of their sacred law would endure as the backbone of the nation. All the monumental changes that one observes in the Judean Commonwealth 200 years later were the work of this dedicated body of scholars and religious leaders. The new regulations, traditionally attributed to Ezra, the priest and scribe who had restored the sacred law, were in fact the creations of this learned council. These regulations became known under the name of Sopheric regulations, or Deber Sophorim, the words of the scribes, and they laid a firm foundation for a spiritual and social edifice that was to endure for thousands of years. It was during this period that regular readings from the law, the Torah, were established as a central practice of community life. On every Sabbath, the seventh day of rest, and on every holy day, a portion of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, was read aloud to the assembled congregation. Twice each week, when the people from surrounding villages came to market in the towns or to bring their petitions to the courts of justice, select verses from the Pentateuch, though often few in number, were read publicly. At first, only the learned men, skilled in the sacred writings, performed these readings. Yet, gradually, as this practice came to be regarded as an honor of the highest rank, every young man aspired to be called upon to read, to be counted among the learned. The script in which the Torah was written presented a formidable obstacle. The ancient text used Phoenician or Old Babylonian characters, readable only by practiced scribes. For the Judeans living in Persia, as much as for those in Palestine, the Torah remained a book with 7 seals, mysterious and difficult to decipher. It became necessary, therefore, to transform the archaic script of the Hebrew Scriptures, called Ketab Ibrith, into characters familiar to the people living between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, the standard script in the Persian provinces. This new style was called the Assyrian script, or Ketab Ashereth, because it had originated in one of the Assyrian provinces. The Samaritans, however, deliberately retained the old Hebrew characters for their Pentateuch, partly in defiance and partly to accuse the Judeans of introducing a forbidden innovation and falsifying the Torah. To this day, their sacred texts exist in these ancient characters, largely incomprehensible even to many of their own priests. Because of the regular readings and wider accessibility of the law, an extraordinary intellectual activity arose among the Judeans, gradually shaping a distinctive character in the entire nation. The Torah became not only their spiritual heritage but their inner sanctuary, a guide to life and conscience. At this time, schools for young men were established, where the text of the law was taught, and love for its principles and precepts was cultivated. Religious teachers, called scribes, or sopherim, instructed the pupils, known as Talmud Chachim, disciples of the wise. The scribes had a dual role to explain the Torah and to apply its teachings to both individual and communal life. This supplementary interpretation was called midrash, exposition, and it followed established rules, not arbitrary whims. The supreme council of the community and the houses of learning worked in close harmony, each complementing the other. The outcome was a profound mental and spiritual development. The descendants of the patriarchs acquired an almost instinctive impulse to investigate, to interpret, and to exercise ingenuity in discovering hidden meanings in both the words and substance of the law. The Supreme Council, the originator of these educational institutions and intellectual movement, did not limit itself to interpreting existing laws, but also compiled a new code of laws, intended to regulate, stimulate, and strengthen both the religious and social life of the people. An old and respected maxim of Judea guided this work: make a fence about the law. By this, teachers were directed to forbid certain actions which, though technically permissible, approached prohibited matters too closely or could easily be confused with them. This fence, or sayag, was essential to protect the uneducated masses and ensure the faithful observance of precepts in a time of unsettled habits. Entire sets of laws from the Sopheric period were designed to prevent any transgression of the Torah. For example, the degrees of relationship prohibited for marriage were expanded, and to protect chastity, men were forbidden to meet married women in secluded places. The previously lax observance of the Sabbath in Nehemiah's era was replaced by extraordinarily strict enforcement. Work on the day of rest and on festival days had to cease before sunset on the preceding evening, and officials were appointed to sound a horn, announcing the proper hour for repose. The Sabbath and the festivals were intended not only to enforce discipline, but to inspire devotion and elevate the spirit, setting them apart from the mundane routines of daily life. A ritual developed in which wine was poured and a blessing pronounced at the commencement of the festivals, acknowledging that the day was holy and sanctified by God, Kiddush, and again at their close, affirming its special distinction from ordinary days, Habel. Through these laws and practices, the Sabbath acquired a sacred character that transformed it into a central pillar of Judean communal and spiritual life. The first evening of the Paschal Feast, which occurred each spring in remembrance of the Judeans' miraculous deliverance from Egypt, carried extraordinary importance. It was designed to awaken, year after year, a vivid consciousness of freedom and a deep gratitude for the preservation of their nation. A custom, gradually becoming a law, arose of drinking 4 cups of wine during the festival, symbolizing joy and thanksgiving, a practice observed even by the poorest members of the community. On the eve of the Passover, families gathered with their closest friends, not for opulent indulgence, but to offer thanks and praise to the God of their ancestors. They partook of bitter herbs, broke unleavened bread, sampled portions of the paschal lamb in memory of liberation, and drank the 4 cups of wine, celebrating the festival with heartfelt solemnity. Over time, several families would join together to observe the feast collectively, sharing the lamb and singing psalms in a larger assembly, known as a chabura, transforming the paschal even to a meaningful and joyful family celebration. The prayers, as prescribed by the Sopheric authorities, followed no rigid formula, but maintained a consistent line of thought. The temple services in Jerusalem provided the model for worship in all houses of gathering, known as Beth HaKnesset, or synagogues. Daily divine service began in the morning in the temple court with specially selected psalms of praise and thanksgiving. At the conclusion of these psalms, the congregation proclaimed, "Praise be to the God of Israel, who alone doeth wonders, and praise be the glory of his name forever and ever, and may his glory fill the whole earth." This was followed by a prayer of thanksgiving for the light of the sun, given to the whole world, and for the light of the law, given to Israel. Portions of the Torah were then read, including the 10 Commandments and the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, to which the congregation responded, "Blessed be the name of the glory of his kingdom forever and ever." The principal prayer, the tefillah, consisted of 6 segments, a thanksgiving for God's choosing of Israel as his people, an acknowledgment of divine power in nature, exemplified by life-giving rain, and in humanity, foretold by the resurrection of the dead, an acknowledgment of God's holiness, a supplication for the acceptance of prayers and sacrifices, a thanksgiving for preservation of life, and finally, a prayer for peace, concluding with a blessing from the priest. Afternoon and evening prayers were shorter, omitting psalms and portions of the law. On the Sabbath and other festive days, the morning service remained largely the same. Those special prayers highlighted the sanctity of the day, and a longer section from the Torah was read. A portion from the prophets was also included, often chosen to reflect the character of the day. This practice arose in part due to the opposition between the Judeans and the Samaritans, who denied the sanctity of the temple and Jerusalem and rejected the prophetic writings because they emphasized the holy city and the chosen sanctuary. To counteract this, the upholders of Judaism ensured that the prophetic texts were read in every house of prayer, becoming powerful instruments for inspiring national fervor, even if the full meaning was grasped by only a few. These readings concluded with a ceremony called Haftarah. The necessity of an authoritative collection of prophetic writings became clear, and the Sopheric legislative body undertook the task. They compiled 4 historical books: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, called the earlier prophets. Following these were the writings of the 3 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Lastly, the 12 minor prophets, Hosea, Amos, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were included, collectively known with the 3 greater prophets as the later prophets. These writings were recognized as Holy Scripture, secondary in sanctity only to the Torah. Thus, the divine service of the Sopheric Age was carefully constructed. Simple and edifying, it contained nothing superfluous, nothing disturbing or wearisome, and it embodied the spirit of the prophets and psalmists. The sole foreign addition was the belief in the resurrection of the dead on the last day. All other elements derived from the earliest, purest teachings. In the country towns, inhabitants faithfully reproduced this model of divine during the Sopheric Age. The spiritual service of the Judeans became closely intertwined with the sacrificial ceremonies of the temple. 3 times each day, while the priests were presenting offerings upon the altar, the people gathered in the prayer houses to unite in devotion and reflection. On the Sabbath, the holy day of rest, and during festivals when special additional offerings, known as Korban Musaf, were made in the temple. The congregations assembled 4 times for prayer, a practice called Tefillah Musaf. Even as these rituals continued, the living word, the law, and the sacred text grew in importance. It became customary to sing the Psalms between offerings for the sublime poetry-inspired devotion and moral reflection among the people. Yet one aspect of the temple service posed tension with this growing spiritual emphasis. The laws of purity and impurity, as strictly prescribed in the Torah, governed every approach to the sanctuary, the offerings, and even the tasting of consecrated food. Any individual deemed ritually unclean was barred from bringing sacrifices, entering the sacred precincts, or partaking in sacred meals. Degrees of uncleanness were carefully defined, and the law outlined the precise methods for purification, culminating in immersion in fresh running water. These rules, however, took on even greater importance due to the centuries that the Judeans had spent among the Persians, whose own purification laws, recorded in the Avesta and enforced by the Magi, were notoriously strict and often elaborate. Living alongside the Magi, the Judeans could not help but absorb aspects of Persian ritual and discipline, recognizing parallels between their own traditions and those of their reigning neighbors. Despite these external influences, the fundamental conception of the deity remained unchanged among the Judeans. The belief in one incorporeal, perfect God, the God of Israel, was deeply implanted in their hearts. They rejected the Persian dualism of Ahura Mazda, the God of light and goodness, and Andromanius, or Armin, the God of darkness and evil. The Judean seers reasoned that God, the Creator, had fashioned both light and darkness, good and evil, and that the universe was meant to operate in harmony rather than under the influence of 2 opposing forces. This belief was expressed in the morning prayers of the Sopheric Age. God is the creator of light and of darkness. He has created peace and has made everything. While the Judeans resisted altering their understanding of God, Persian influence shaped their conception of the spiritual hierarchy. They imagined that they could magnify the glory of God by surrounding him with a host of obedient celestial beings. The biblical messengers of God evolved under this influence into angels, endowed with distinctive characteristics and identities. The people pictured God's throne encircled by myriads of angels, ready to execute his will at a moment's command. Angels acquired Hebrew names: Michael, the protector, Gabriel; the messenger, Raphael; the healer, Uriel, or Suriel; the light, Matatoran, and others. As the angels were shaped by Persian models, so too were evil spirits introduced into Judean belief. Satan emerged as a figure patterned on Andromanius, though never equated with the God of Israel, for the high and mighty Creator could not be challenged by a creature. Yet in time, Satan was imagined as a powerful ruler of his own dark kingdom, commanding a hierarchy of demonic beings, including Shittim, Mazkim, and Malash Chabala. Among these, Ashmedai and Samael were prominent leaders of malevolent forces, while the angel of death, Malacham Maveth, was envisioned as ever vigilant, with 1,000 eyes, ready to claim lives. These imaginative constructs, combined with imagined influence, strengthened ritual observances, particularly laws concerning purification, which became increasingly stringent. It was also during this period that the Judeans adopted a doctrine of retribution after death. Inspired by the Iranian dualist vision, the universe was divided conceptually into realms of light and darkness. The righteous, aligned with God, would enter paradise, while the wicked, associated with Satan and evil forces, would descend into a realm of punishment. After death, souls lingered near the body for 3 days before being taken by divine messengers to paradise or drawn down by evil spirits into the realm of darkness. This fusion of Persian and Judean thought created a more developed sense of moral accountability and cosmic justice within the Judean religious consciousness. E-service in their local congregations. Houses of prayer, known as synagogues or model, were established throughout the land, combining prayers and the sacrifices prescribed by the law into a unified form of worship, each element reinforcing the other and sustaining the religious life of the community. The Garden of Eden, known in Hebrew as Gan Eden, long celebrated in the story of creation as the dwelling place of the first human beings living in a state of innocence, was transformed in the collective imagination into paradise. In stark contrast, the Valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna, a place infamous since the reign of King Ahaz for the horrific practice of offering children as sacrifices to foreign deities, became the archetypal hell. How these novel beliefs, angels, Satan, and his attendant spirits, paradise, and how entered the Judean faith is a question that remains as obscure as the unseen ways in which disease may infect the human body. Yet these ideas did not become fixed dogmas that one must accept under threat of mortal sin. Instead, during that period, and continuing into later generations, their acceptance remained a matter of individual discretion. One exception, however, emerged from the teachings of the Iranian religion, the resurrection of the dead. This doctrine, promoted by the Magi, the priestly interpreters of the Zoroastrian faith, gradually became part of Judean spiritual life and ultimately evolved into a binding tenet. According to the Magi, the reawakening of the dead would occur at a future epoch when Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of light and truth, would triumph over his rival, the god of darkness, and reclaim the bodies of the righteous stolen by the powers of evil. The Judeans of the Sopheric Age, the age of scribes and literary preservation, adopted this hopeful doctrine eagerly, encouraged by earlier prophetic writings. Their prophets had repeatedly spoken of the day of judgment, and the scribes interpreted this as a promise of resurrection. Daily prayers began to include expressions of gratitude to God for awakening the dead to life. Centuries later, when the Judean nation faced the specter of death and exile, a seer offered comfort to the suffering, many of those who are sleeping in death will awake, some to eternal life, and some to disgrace and everlasting abhorrence, as recorded in the 12th chapter of the book of Daniel. From this emerged a doctrine of divine recompense, coupled with a vivid vision of the future, or Olam Haba, the world to come. Believers imagine a magical reality in which all the discord and disappointment of earthly existence would vanish, where the faithful, the pious, and the just would rise from their graves to enter eternal life in purity and innocence. Even sinners, whose errors were born of weakness or frivolity, could find redemption through penitence and enjoy everlasting bliss. The details of how resurrection would occur or how this envisioned world would be structured remain unknowable. Fervent faith and hope, however, did not dwell upon such questions. It was sufficient that the righteous were promised a just recompense and the solace of the future life, thereby mitigating the sorrows of mortal existence. Although this teaching had its origins outside Judea, the Judeans enriched it, shaped it, and made it an inseparable part of their religion. By the passage of time, its foreign origin was forgotten, and it was regarded as a distinctly Judean doctrine, though the Samaritans resisted it for some time, questioning both the resurrection and the concept of a future life. For nearly 2 centuries, from the death of Nehemiah in the early 4th century before the Common Era to the final years of the Persian Empire, the Judean community labored quietly to consolidate itself and to develop Judaism. In this long period, few individual names emerged from the records of their toil. Perhaps the spiritual leaders intentionally veiled themselves in obscurity to avoid personal glorification, or perhaps posterity, unmindful of their work, failed to record them. It is also possible that the members of the Great Council, the governing body of 70 elders, were not individually remarkable, yet the community as a whole, with every individual absorbed in the collective effort, produced a vigorous and lasting religious culture. Whatever the reason, the remarkable fact remains that details from this era are scarce. Either annals were not kept, or they were lost, and the outward life of the Judean community was largely unremarkable. The Judean people devoted themselves almost entirely to peaceful labors, tending fields, homes, and religious observances. They knew little of the use of arms, lacking even the capacity to defend their territories from the threats of neighboring tribes. In this period of quiet consolidation, the prophet Ezekiel had foretold the post-exilic condition of the people. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is turned away from the sword, and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, as recorded in the 38th chapter and 8th verse of the book of Ezekiel. The community was gathering strength, not through conquest or outward might, but through faith, law, and the careful cultivation of religious and moral life, laying the foundations for Judaism that would endure through centuries of challenge and change. A peaceful and quiet existence naturally withdraws itself from curious observation, and the Judean people, though mindful of their faith and traditions, largely remained apart from the turbulence of the world beyond their borders. Yet the lands around them were far from tranquil. During the reign of Artaxerxes II, surnamed Neman, who ruled Persia from the year 404 before the Common Era to 362 before the Common Era, and later under Artaxerxes III, surnamed Achis, reigning from 361 before the Common Era to 338 before the Common Era, leaders of discontent in Egypt, some of whom declared themselves kings, endeavored to free their country from the Persian yoke and restore its former independence. To confront these insurrections, the ephemeral kings of Egypt allied themselves with the Persian satraps, provincial governors of Phoenicia, the coastal region stretching along the eastern Mediterranean, to which Judea had also been administratively assigned. Persian troops marched along the Judean coast toward Egypt, while Egyptian forces moved toward Phoenicia, and Greek mercenaries, hired by either power, traversed these regions. From the mountain tops of their homeland, the Judean people could observe the movement of armies, the clamor of war, and the flashing banners of foreign powers. Though they were not compelled to fight, they were not exempt from levies, taxes, and burdens imposed upon subjects caught between warring kingdoms. At the same time, relations between the Judeans and their Persian overlords became strained by matters of religion. The Persians, influenced by foreign customs, began to practice idolatry. The goddess of love, known variously as Beltis, Milea, or Aphrodite, exercised a seductive power over them. Their victories and accumulated wealth inclined them toward sensual pleasures, and they were easily captivated by this deity, whom they incorporated into their religion under the Persian names Anahita or Anaides. Artaxerxes II sanctioned her worship, commissioning images to be placed throughout his vast kingdom in the cities of Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana, as well as in Damascus, Sardis, and other towns across Persia and Bactria. Through this innovation, the Persian religion suffered a double injury. A foreign deity was admitted, and the practice of image worship, abhorrent to the followers of the Jewish faith, became accepted. The spiritual bond that had linked the Persians and the Judeans, the shared abhorrence of idolatry, was broken. No longer was pure incense offered to the incorporeal god of the Judeans. Having compelled his own people to bow before this newly adopted goddess of love, Artaxerxes attempted, as it appears, to enforce her worship upon the Judeans. Those who refused were subjected to cruelty, punishment, and even death. Yet the Judeans, steadfast in their faith, endured suffering rather than renounce the religion of their fathers. Some accounts suggest that after his campaigns against the Egyptians and their king Tachos, ruling from 361 before the Common Era to 360 before the Common Era, Artaxerxes exiled many Judeans to Hyrcania, along the southern shores of the Caspian Sea. If this account is accurate, such banishments were a deliberate persecution aimed at punishing the Judeans for their fidelity to the law and to God, as it is unlikely they had participated in the revolt that spread from Egypt to Phoenicia. Within Jerusalem itself, the people endured further suffering, inflicted by one of those abject opportunists who, amid the growing degeneracy of the Persian court and the weakening of the kingdom, rose from obscurity to wield extraordinary power. This was the eunuch Bagos, also called Bagoses, who under Artaxerxes III attained such influence that he could manipulate the king and determine the affairs of the throne according to his own will. Before reaching the pinnacle of power, Bagos had commanded the troops stationed in Syria and Phoenicia, and he used this position to amass great wealth. Into this unstable world stepped Joshua, the ambitious younger son of the high priest Joiada, seeking the high priestly office for himself. His elder brother, Johanan, opposed him, and a violent struggle erupted within the temple itself. Johanan struck down the younger Joshua in the sanctuary, a grim omen for the Judean community. On hearing of the incident, Bagos did not act in righteous vengeance, but seized the opportunity to extort wealth from the Judeans. For every lamb offered in the daily sacrifices, the people were required to pay 50 drachms as expiatory money every morning before the sacred ritual. Bagos also violated the temple's sanctity by entering the holy place, mocking the priests and questioning whether he was not as pure as the murdered son of the high priest. This burdensome tribute persisted for 7 years before the Judeans were finally relieved. Meanwhile, their malevolent neighbors, the Samaritans, exploited the disfavor of the Persian kings to reclaim border territories, including Ramatime, Firma, and Lydda, which they had previously been forced to abandon. The Judeans, once buoyed by hope and the initial light of freedom during the reign of Darius the Great, and later by the fervent energy of Nehemiah in Jerusalem, now faced a relentless struggle for mere survival. The brief glimpses of prosperity and security they had enjoyed over the previous 200 years had been fleeting, eclipsed by the rising darkness of political intrigue, foreign oppression, and internal strife. With these exceptions, the lot of the Judeans had been one of oppression, poverty, and pitiable helplessness. They appear in the records of history as a people whose tearful, uplifted eyes seem ever to ask, "Whence shall help come to us?" Traces of this helplessness and misery are evident in the writings that have survived from that period. During the years of exile, the grief and longing of the captives held in constant and breathless expectation, had given rise to some of the finest blossoms of prophecy and poetry. Yet as soon as the excitement of hope was replaced by reality, the intensity of their mental and poetic activity began to wane. The later prophetic writings, judged by the beauty of form, could not rival those composed during the captivity. The Psalms, once a vibrant fountain of devotion, became weaker and full of repetitions, often borrowing their grace from older productions. An exception in this literary decline was the Book of Ruth, which retained its elegance and charm. Historical accounts, too, were largely neglected. Ezra, the scribe and priest who had led the Judeans in religious and social reform, and Nehemiah, the governor who had rebuilt Jerusalem's walls, left only brief and unpolished records of the events they had witnessed. Toward the end of this epoch, as the Persian dominion drew to a close, a Levite undertook the compilation of a historical work known as Chronicles, narrating events from the creation down to his own time. However, during the lifetime of the author, or shortly thereafter, a new era dawned, bringing fresh intellectual energy among the Judeans and revealing their enduring capacity and worth. This new period was marked by the rise of the Greeks, whose influence reshaped manners, customs, and thought across the known world. Civilization was elevated not by pure Greek blood alone, but by the mixed people of Greeks and barbarians, the Macedonians. The grace and charm of Greek culture won admiration, but their faults, their jealousies, foibles, and restless nature left them vulnerable to ambitious leaders skilled in flattery, wealth, and military might. Philip, king of Macedonia, exemplified such a leader, dazzling Greece with his cunning, riches, valor, and army. Though he sought to unite the Greek states for a campaign against Persia, jealousy and petty rivalries among the cities hampered his plans. Some states refused to participate, while others required bribery to gain their consent. Philip's campaign was abruptly ended by assassination. Then appeared his son, Alexander, later called Alexander the Great, a young man destined to transform the entire geopolitical landscape. He drew even the peaceful Judeans into the vortex of vast and violent world conflicts. One Judean seer likened Alexander to a leopard endowed with the wings of an eagle. In two decisive battles, Alexander shattered the decaying Persian monarchy. Asia Minor, Syria, and Phoenicia fell beneath his dominion, and kings and princes, adorned in their finest regalia, paid homage to the conqueror. Tyre, after a grueling 7-month siege, and Gaza, after 2 months, were taken in August and November of the year 332 before the Common Era, suffering cruel fates at the hands of the victor. Yet how did the small and relatively insignificant territory of Judea fare before the invincible hero before whom even Egypt, the proud land of the Pharaohs, had fallen prostrate? Historical records from this time survive mainly in the form of legend, leaving the precise details uncertain. The widely circulated story claims that Alexander was moved by a vision, appearing in a dream in Macedonia, that promised him victory if he showed favor to the Judeans. According to tradition, the high priest either Janu or his grandson Simon met Alexander dressed in full priestly garments, accompanied by a retinue of priests and Levites, and so impressed him that his anger was transformed into kindness and goodwill. In reality, the meeting between Alexander and the Judean envoys was likely simpler and more practical. The high priest, perhaps Onias, a son of Jadua and father of Simon, advanced with a suite of elders, as was customary for kings and princes, to pay homage and pledge allegiance to the conqueror. Alexander was known as a noble and generous ruler, punishing only those who resisted his authority. He did not impose Greek religion on the peoples he conquered, nor did he interfere with their customs or religious rites. The Judeans were permitted to continue their practices freely, obliged only to pay the Macedonian governor the same taxes previously collected by the Persian satrap. The first encounter between Greece and Judea, two civilizations destined in their own ways to shape the world, was marked by contrast and tension. Greece appeared in the full glory of her power, a vast empire forged through conquest and military mastery, while Judea presented herself in humility, diminished by years of exile and occupation. Judea had become part of a larger province, a territory bounded on the north by the snow-capped Mount Taurus and the forested peaks of Mount Lebanon, and on the south by the deserts and Nile basin of Egypt. This province was called Hollow Syria, or Cilicyria, to distinguish it from Higher Syria, which lay near the course of the Euphrates River. The governor appointed over this extensive province resided in Samaria, a town that had earned both strategic importance and dangerous renown due to its central location and fertile surroundings. The governor installed by Alexander the Great, Andromacho's, faced immediate hostility from the Samaritans. Whether their resentment stemmed from a feeling of restricted movement under the governor, or from jealousy over Alexander's favor toward the Judeans, it erupted into violence. In the year 331 before the Common Era, the Samaritans captured Andromachus and executed him by fire. The fury of Alexander upon hearing of this atrocity was immense, justified by both his military authority and his personal indignation. This small, seemingly insignificant people had dared to defy the conqueror who had subdued Egypt, whose proud priests had prostrated themselves before him, proclaiming his greatness. Alexander, hastening from Egypt to continue his conquest of Persia, moved swiftly to Samaria to avenge the murder. The perpetrators were executed under harsh torture. A new governor, Memnon, was appointed, and the town was garrisoned with Macedonian soldiers. Alexander took further measures to humiliate the Samaritans and, in contrast, rewarded the Judeans. He granted border lands, historically contested between Samaria and Judea, to the Judeans, and freed them from taxation during the sabbatical year. For Alexander, these actions may have seemed minor, but for the Judeans, they were significant blessings, and for the Samaritans, they ignited an enduring hatred. At the height of his conquest, Alexander's campaigns had extended as far as the Indus River and the Caucasus Mountains, spreading across a domain from Greece to India, and from the Ethiopian highlands to the Caspian Sea. His unprecedented victories created a spell of awe that suppressed independent action, assuring peace when he was not engaged in war. Unlike many conquerors before him, Alexander allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religious traditions. In Egypt, he honored the bull deities and the god Ammon, while in Babylonia, he respected the pantheon of Chaldean gods. He even ordered the reconstruction of the Temple of Bel, a Babylonian idol previously destroyed by King Artaxerxes. Soldiers were commanded to clear the ruins of the sacred foundations, yet the Judeans, whether out of voluntary conviction or conscription, refused to assist in rebuilding a temple devoted to idolatry. This act of religious obedience brought severe punishment from their military superiors, yet the Judeans endured with courage, demonstrating unwavering fidelity to the commandments of their faith. Alexander, upon learning of their principled stand, pardoned them, revealing both his sense of justice and foreshadowing the inevitable cultural and religious conflicts between the expanding Hellenic world and Judaism. In the year 323 before the Common Era, at the peak of his global ambitions, Alexander the Great died suddenly, leaving no legitimate heir to continue his empire, no successor capable of matching his vision. Chaos ensued across his vast territories and within his formidable armies. The precision of conquest and administration gave way to disorder, as generals who had fought together on thousands of battlefields now pursued personal ambition. These warriors, like the Greeks themselves, prized power as a means to wealth and indulgence, and their lack of discipline precipitated the dissolution of the Macedonian Empire. Out of this tumult arose the successors of Alexander, the Diadochi, who carved the empire into competing kingdoms. Ptolemy Isoter, son of Lagas, seized Egypt and, through military campaigns, acquired Cilicia and Judea. In the year 320 before the Common Era, Ptolemy demanded the surrender of Jerusalem. The inhabitants initially resisted, refusing to open their gates. Yet on the Sabbath, a day on which Judean law forbade the use of weapons for defense, Ptolemy executed a surprise assault. Jerusalem fell, and numerous inhabitants were taken prisoner and transported to Egypt. Many Samaritans suffered the same fate, likely because they had attempted to resist alongside the Judeans. Under Ptolemy, the Judeans and Samaritans experienced the consequences of being caught between imperial ambition and religious fidelity. They could have enjoyed stability and protection under the relatively mild rule of the Lagidian Ptolemy, yet the exigencies of conquest, the constraints of Sabbath observance, and the enmity of neighboring communities ensured that these events would shape the Judean experience of Hellenistic rule for generations. Ptolemy, the first ruler of the Ptolemaic or Lagidian kingdom in Egypt, was a man who could recognize and reward merit, and when his personal interests were not at stake, he was both just and merciful. Yet his possession of Cilicia, the region encompassing southern Syria and parts of modern Lebanon, had no firm legal foundation. The lands he controlled had never been formally confirmed by the succession of Macedonian regents who had governed the territories of Alexander the Great after his death in 323 before the Common Era. This tenuous claim stirred the envy of his fellow generals, the Confederate captains who had once been his allies in the wars of the Diadochi, the successors of Alexander. Among them, Antigonus, a bold and fiery soldier endowed with inventive genius, harbored ambitions to subjugate all of his comrades and seize the entire Macedonian kingdom for himself. Years of careful preparation for war culminated in a decisive battle in the spring of 312 before the Common Era, fought near the city of Gaza on the southern coast of Cilicia. The clash was between Ptolemy and Demetrius, the son of Antigonus. The battle ended disastrously for Demetrius, and in its wake, Seleucus, who had arrived at Ptolemy's court as a fugitive, marked the beginning of his own power. Seleucus, who would become the founder of the Seleucidian kingdom in Persia, began the new era known as the Seleucidine era, which was adopted even by the Judeans and retained in their records for centuries. In consequence of this defeat, Demetrius was forced to withdraw northward, leaving Ptolemy in control of the contested territories. However, the triumph was temporary. Antigonus and his son soon reunited their forces and compelled Ptolemy to retreat to Egypt. In response, Antigonus ordered the demolition of key fortified cities along the coast and inland Nico, Joppa, Gaza, and Jerusalem so that they could not serve as defenses for Ptolemy or his allies. Judea and the surrounding Cilician lands were left unguarded until the decisive battle at Ipsus, fought in Asia Minor in 301 before the Common Era. There, the united armies of Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Seleucus defeated Antigonus, extinguishing both his glory and his life in a single blow. The victors divided his territories. Ptolemy retained Egypt and the adjoining lands, while Seleucus received the greater portion of Asia. From that moment, Judea became part of the Ptolemaic kingdom, its fate entwined with that of Egypt under the Lygidian dynasty. The condition of the Judeans, however, changed little in practical terms. The taxes and tribute previously owed to the Persian monarch were now demanded by the Egypto-Macedonian court. Their freedom of movement and the autonomy of their actions were largely unaffected, and in some respects their situation improved. In Judea, the high priest was not merely a religious leader, but also the political head responsible for paying these taxes, effectively a sacerdotal prince. Ptolemy I, known for his gentle nature and inclination to benefit his subjects, had no desire to oppress them. In Alexandria, the great seaport city founded by Alexander the Great and considered the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom, many Judeans had already settled under Alexander's policy of granting full Macedonian citizenship to all inhabitants. This first Judean colony in Alexandria enjoyed equal rights and led a peaceful life. During the unrest caused by the wars of Antigonus, additional Judeans migrated there, receiving protection and legal equality under Ptolemy. A new Egypto-Judean community arose, destined to fulfill a unique role in history. Other Judean colonies were also established in various Egyptian cities, and in the city of Cyrene, a Greek settlement on the northern coast of Africa, demonstrating Ptolemy's policy of distributing his subjects to consolidate loyalty and stability. Meanwhile, Seleucus, the founder of the Seleucidian kingdom with its center in Persia, secured the northern part of Syria and founded a new capital, Antioch. To populate the city and other newly built towns, he brought in settlers, both voluntarily and forcibly, among them many Judeans, to whom he granted full Macedonian citizenship. In the same manner, as Judean colonies expanded into Greco-Macedonian lands, Greek colonies were established on Judean soil. Along the Mediterranean coast, new seaports were constructed, old harbors were enlarged and beautified, and each was given a Greek name, transforming the region into a mosaic of cultural and political influence. The Judeans, though now living under foreign rulers, experienced a continuity of religious, civic, and social life. Their communities were integrated into the larger Hellenistic world, yet maintained their identity, law, and customs, a remarkable survival amid the shifting tides of empire and conquest.